A heat wave is turning Greenland's ice to slush. That's bad news. Summer meltwater collects in a lake on the surface of the Greenland ice sheet. On the Greenland ice sheet, high at the top of the planet, things are not well. The heat wave that has now migrated northward, parking itself over Greenland. As air temperature, this is the second major hot stretch to hit the ice sheet this season, and the second to cause melting across major swaths of the ice sheet. The heat waves were already, the melt extent is well outside the range of watts normally observed at this time of year, said a polar scientist at the Danish Meteorological Institute. These are records we don't want to see broken, she says. So far, 2019 is shaping up to rival the worst melt year on record 2012. At its worst point, in July of 2012, 97% of the surface of the Greenland ice sheet was experiencing some sort of melt. Scientists estimate to have been the icy, more than mile-high interior of the ice sheet, which rarely had been seen to soften. Melt coursing off the ice sheet caused rivers to gush so intensely that they blew out bridges in coastal towns. Scientists, by the end of July 2012, enough to tick global sea levels up by about 0.8 of a millimeter. That's pretty close to the estimated 248 billion tons that have been lost so far this year, according to observations made by a polar scientist at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. We're basically on pace. We're in the ballpark. On Tuesday alone, the ice sheet shed about 7 billion tons of melt. That's enough water. That may not sound like a lot, but it adds up quickly. Global average by 2100, accelerating ice loss and surface melting from Greenland's ice could dump somewhere between about into the seas. If the whole ice sheet this season alone won't make or break global sea levels. But this season, parts of the Greenland ice sheet melt every summer, as Earth tilts its northern face toward the sun. At the edges of the ice, but usually, the melt is confined to those fringes, and the loss from melt is balanced to at least partial IUB snowfall. Fresh snow all over the winter, very little snow fell across the western edge of the ice sheet. That meant that so when the first heat wave of the summer arrived in June, up to about 45% of the ice sheet hit a melting point well above the 10% usually observed at that time of year. Air temperatures, and because partially melted ice is darker than fresh snow, that event meant that the ice sheet was vulnerable to any more heat waves that might come along. It's like a kind of preconditioning for later melt, says Mottram. When the most recent heat wave started to move north, scientists were prepared to see massive melting start up again across the island. So far, scientists already know that climate change has a hand in lengthening and intensifying the melt seasons in Greenland. In 2012, the big question, though, is whether this kind of extreme summer melt will soon become commonplace. Some scientists, like an ice sheet modeler at the University of Lodz, think so. The volume and intensity of melting occurring today, he says, is on par with what models predict will occur nearly every summer by 2050. So record-breaking, this is not just one hot summer among a lot of cool ones, he said. This kind of the exact details of why melting is accelerating across the ice sheet are still being worked out. But part of the reason, the shape of the northern hemisphere jet stream is at least partly controlled by the difference in temperature between the equator and the Arctic. The Arctic has warmed. That means that weather patterns like the heat wave that baked Europe last week, or the devastating rains that flooded the US Midwest in the spring get stuck in place for longer, said an atmospheric scientist at Rutgers. And in turn, that means more opportunity for melting when the hot phases get stuck over Greenland. We've seen these records falling more rapidly as time goes on, says Francis. They're very clearly search for location/city.
Raindrop, drop top smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park pot.